this is Mrs. Moret with a video on how to write equations for a sine or cosine function given its graph. So in order to do that, you need to be able to describe all of these key features that we have down here. So first is the midline. The midline for this graph is y equals -1. Since the midline is an actual horizontal line, you do need to write it as an equation, y equals -1. The amplitude for this graph, which is the distance halfway from the maximum height to the minimum height, that's a distance of 2. And so half of 2 is equal to 1. And so the amplitude is 1. This particular function doesn't have a phase shift because it does start right here at 0 on the midline, and that's what a sine function does without a phase shift. Without a phase shift, a sine function starts at 0 on the midline, so the phase shift is actually 0. The period, which is the distance that it takes for a function to complete one full cycle. So if this starts at the midline and goes to the maximum, then the minimum, and then back to the midline, that's one cycle of this sine function, and it has a horizontal distance. From 0 to pi is a distance of pi. And so the period is equal to pi. So then when we find the frequency is, well, if you look back at your notes on frequency, it says 2 pi divided by the period. So for this function, 2 pi divided by the period, which is pi, is equal to 2. So knowing what these values are, we can then use this format to write our equation. So we're going to say y equals, the amplitude is 1, so I don't need to write it, and then the sine of the frequency, so we're here at B, the frequency is 2, so 2, and then x. Don't really need that set of parentheses, but I usually put it there because if there is a phase shift, you absolutely need to have those parentheses. So there's not a phase shift, but there is a vertical shift, that's the midline, and the midline's at -1, so we're going to write -1 at the end. So y equals the sine of 2x minus 1. This next example, we're going to write, instead of a sine function, we're going to write it as a cosine function. You've probably figured out that you literally could write them as either. So you just want to either make your own choice if it's up to you, or read the prompt carefully so you know if you're looking for a cosine function or a sine function. So we'll start with midline. The midline of this function is at y equals 0. The amplitude, well, here's the highest point to the lowest, and so half of that is 3. That's a distance of 6. Half of 6 is 3, so the amplitude is 3. For phase shift, once again, this function doesn't have a phase shift because in a cosine function, when x is 0, the function is at its maximum value if there isn't a phase shift. So for phase shift, I'm going to say 0 again. The period, so again, I want to say, okay, from this beginning all the way down to the minimum and then back up to the maximum. This distance here is the period. And it goes from 0 to 2 pi. So this is a period of 2 pi, which means the frequency is equal to 2 pi divided by 2 pi, which is equal to 1. And so for this equation, when we put everything together, we have an amplitude of 3. So we do have an amplitude here. So y equals, the amplitude is 3. And again, we're doing cosine. The frequency is 1, and there isn't a phase shift, so it's just cosine of x. And the midline is at 0, so there's nothing to write at the end. So y equals 3 times the cosine of x is the equation for this graph.